Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the people you trust the most. A maid found a letter she was never supposed to see. And when the billionaire walked in seconds later, his fiancée didn't panic. She smiled. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of betrayal, quiet courage, and a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years. It's emotional. It's heartbreaking. And it ends in a way that will stay with you. Let's begin. Everything looked perfect. Until it wasn't. Marisol Vega had been cleaning the Whitfield estate for 6 years. 6 years of polished marble floors, folded Egyptian cotton sheets, and silence. The particular silence of a house where everyone is performing happiness for an audience that never shows up. She was 34, a single mother to an 8-year-old boy named Eli, and she worked the way people work when there is no safety net beneath them. Carefully, quietly, without complaint. The Whitfield estate sat on 11 acres outside Charleston, South Carolina, with white columns that caught the morning light like something out of a movie set. Daniel Whitfield had built a logistics empire from nothing. Trucks, warehouses, shipping contracts that spanned 3 continents, and at 41, he was one of those men magazines like to call self-made, as if the word made loneliness look glamorous. He was engaged to Vivian Ashcroft. Vivian was everything the tabloids loved. Blonde, magnetic, effortlessly cruel in the way only truly beautiful people can afford to be. She had been in Daniel's life for 2 years, and in that time, Marisol had learned to read the house the way sailors read weather. She knew which mornings Vivian would be sweet to the staff because Daniel was watching, and which mornings she'd snap at Marisol over a wrinkle in a duvet cover because he wasn't. That Tuesday started like every other day. Marisol arrived at 7, let herself in through the service entrance, and began the ritual she performed 1,000 times. The kitchen first, then the studies, then the west wing where Daniel kept his private office and reading room. She was dusting the built-in bookshelves in that reading room when a stack of old hardcovers shifted under her cloth and toppled sideways, and something slipped out from between 2 of them and fluttered to the floor. It was an envelope. Yellowed. Sealed. No stamp, no postmark. The kind of envelope that had been hand-delivered and hidden, not mailed. Marisol almost put it back without looking. That was the rule, unspoken but absolute. You don't touch what isn't yours, you don't read what isn't addressed to you, you keep your head down and your job intact. But there was a name on the front, written in handwriting she recognized instantly because she'd seen it on grocery lists and reminder notes around the house for 2 years. Vivian. And beneath the name, smaller, almost like an afterthought, if anything ever happens to me before the wedding, give this to Daniel. Marisol's hands went still. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself to put it back exactly where she found it and pretend this moment never happened. But something about the phrase, if anything ever happens to me, sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading out before she could stop them. She turned the envelope over once. It wasn't sealed with glue anymore. The flap had come loose with age, curling up at the corner like it was inviting her in. She should not have opened it. She opened it anyway. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph slid out first, landing face up on the hardwood floor, and Marisol felt her breath catch before her mind even finished processing what she was looking at. It was Vivian. Younger, maybe 5 years younger, laughing, her head thrown back, wrapped in the arms of a man who was very clearly not Daniel Whitfield. They were standing in front of a small brick church, and Vivian was wearing white. A wedding dress. Marisol's pulse thudded in her ears. She unfolded the letter with fingers that had gone unsteady, and the first line hit her like a slap. My darling Thomas, 3 years married and you still make my heart race like it's our first date. It was a love letter, written to a husband Marisol had never once heard mentioned in this house. In 2 years of engagement gossip, wedding planning, and Vivian's endless stories about her complicated past. Married. Vivian Ashcroft was, or had been, married. And she had never told Daniel. Marisol's mind raced through the calendar in her head. The wedding to Daniel was in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and this house had been buzzing for months with caterers and florists, and a guest list of 400 people. And somewhere buried behind a row of leather-bound novels was proof that the bride might already belong to someone else. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She fumbled to slide the photograph back into the envelope, to close the flap, to shove it back between the books exactly as it had been. But her hands were shaking too hard, and the envelope slipped from her fingers and landed face up on the antique rug just as the office door swung open. It was Daniel. He stood in the doorway in his charcoal suit, tie slightly loosened, looking at Marisol crouched on the floor with a torn envelope and a photograph of his fiancée in another man's arms scattered at her feet. And right behind him, arriving a half-second later with a glass of champagne still in her hand, was Vivian. Marisol braced herself for the fiancé's rage, for screaming, for the accusation of snooping, of theft, of every ugly word a woman like Vivian could summon on command. Instead, Vivian's lips curled into something worse than anger. She smiled. Nobody could explain what happened next. Vivian's smile wasn't the smile of someone caught. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting, patiently, almost eagerly, for exactly this moment to arrive. "Oh," Vivian said softly, setting her champagne glass down on the mahogany desk with a delicate clink. "You found it." Daniel looked from the envelope on the floor, to Marisol frozen on her knees, to his fiancée's unervingly calm face. "Found what?" His voice had the particular flatness of a man who already suspects the answer will change his life. Marisol wanted to disappear into the floorboards. "Mr. Whitfield, I was dusting the shelves and it fell out and I shouldn't have opened it. I'm so sorry. It's fine, Marisol." Daniel's eyes hadn't left Vivian. "Leave us." Marisol scrambled to her feet, but as she turned to go, Vivian's voice cut through the room like a blade wrapped in silk. "No. Stay." Everyone froze. Marisol had never once, in 6 years, been given an order by Vivian that wasn't about laundry or wine glasses. "She should stay," Vivian said again, folding her arms, that smile still ghosting at the corner of her mouth. "Since she's already seen it, might as well let her hear the rest." Daniel bent down and picked up the photograph. His jaw tightened as he studied it. The church, the white dress, the man's arm circling Vivian's waist like he owned the world. "Who is this?" "Thomas," Vivian said, like the name tasted sweet. "My husband." The word landed in the room and detonated. "Your husband." Daniel's voice cracked on the second syllable. "Vivian. We're getting married in 6 weeks. 400 people. My mother's dress. You told me your only real relationship before me was some college boyfriend who cheated." "I lied." Vivian said it so simply, so without apology, that Marisol felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Thomas and I married when I was 26. He died 2 years later. Car accident if you're curious. I never divorced anyone because there was no one left to divorce. I'm not married now, Daniel, if that's what's frightening you. I'm free. I've always been free." Daniel's shoulders sagged half an inch, the tension of bigamy fear draining out of him. But Marisol watched Vivian's eyes and understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent years reading this house's silences, that this was not the twist. This was the setup. "Then why hide it?" Daniel said quietly. "Why keep a photograph in a place I'd never look? with a note that says, "Give this to Daniel if anything happens to me." That's not a woman protecting a private grief, Vivian. That's a woman building insurance. Vivian's smile finally faltered, not into fear, but into something colder, more calculating, as if a curtain had dropped and revealed the stage behind it. "You're smarter than people give you credit for," she said. "Fine. You want honesty. Here it is. Thomas left me everything when he died. A life insurance payout, a house, a small fortune for a 28-year-old widow. I built my whole life afterward on that money. And on the story I told about who I was before you. Self-made, just like you love to call yourself. Except I wasn't self-made. I was widow-made. And if that story ever got out to your board, to the press, to your mother who thinks I hung the moon, it wouldn't just embarrass me, Daniel. It would embarrass you. Marrying a woman who profited from grief. So I kept the letter as a reminder to myself. Nothing more. It was a good lie. Smooth, plausible, wrapped in just enough vulnerability to disarm a man who wanted, more than anything, to believe her. Daniel almost took it. Marisol saw it happen, saw his shoulders loosen, saw forgiveness start to form behind his eyes. And something in her, some small stubborn thing that had watched this house for 6 years and noticed every mismatched thread in Vivian's carefully tailored story, made her open her mouth before she could stop herself. "Mr. Whitfield," Marisol said quietly, "the letter isn't addressed to you as a reminder to herself. It says if anything ever happens to me before the wedding. Not before Thomas's accident. Before this wedding. Yours." The room went silent enough to hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands, and for the first time, he read the note aloud himself, slowly, like each word cost him something. "If anything ever happens to me before the wedding, give this to Daniel." He looked up. "Vivian, why would you write instructions for someone to give me a letter about your dead husband? Only if you die before our wedding. What does that mean? What happens after the wedding that makes this letter safe to bury forever?" Vivian said nothing. And in the silence, Marisol understood she had just uncovered something far bigger than an old love letter. Something that made the room feel colder, and Vivian's smile, now gone completely, feel like the most honest thing she'd shown anyone in years. The truth was hiding in plain sight. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he set the photograph down on the desk. "Answer me, Vivian." For the first time since Marisol had known her, Vivian looked genuinely cornered. Her eyes flicked toward the door, toward the window, toward anywhere that wasn't Daniel's face. The universal instinct of someone calculating an exit that didn't exist. "It's not what you think," she finally said. "You keep saying things aren't what I think," Daniel replied. "And every single time it turns out they're worse." Vivian exhaled slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its polish entirely. What remained underneath sounded younger, harder, and far more tired. "Thomas's death wasn't an accident," she said. "Or it was ruled an accident. Officially. But I know what happened because I was the one who arranged the brake failure." Marisol's stomach dropped straight through the floor. Daniel went white. What did you just say?" "He was going to leave me," Vivian said, and now there was no performance left in her voice at all. Just a flat, exhausted honesty, the kind that only comes out after years of holding something too heavy to carry alone. 3 years into the marriage, he found out I'd been lying to him too. About money I'd taken from his business, about a man I'd seen before him. He was filing for divorce. He was going to leave with almost everything because his lawyer was better than mine, and I had nothing left to build a life on. So I made sure he never got the chance to file. Daniel took a step back like the words had physically struck him. "You killed him." "I arranged something," Vivian corrected, as though the distinction mattered, as though softening the verb could soften what she'd done. "And I got away with it. The insurance paid out. Nobody asked the right questions. I was young and grieving and grieving beautiful women don't get investigated, Daniel. They get sympathy casseroles and sad newspaper columns. The clock in the hallway kept ticking. Marisol realized she'd been holding her breath for almost a full minute. "And the letter," Daniel said slowly, forcing the words out like they were made of glass. "The letter that only gets opened before our wedding." "Why?" Vivian's jaw tightened. "Because Thomas wrote it. Not me. He wrote it 3 days before he died after our fight. A confession, I think, or an apology. I never fully finished reading it, I couldn't. He must have suspected something was wrong between us. Must have wanted someone to have proof of who he really was if something happened to him. I found it in his coat pocket after the funeral. I couldn't destroy it. I don't know why, some superstition, some guilt I couldn't shake, so I hid it. And I told myself if it was ever found before I married again, I'd face it. Face what I did. Confess, maybe, finally, to someone. But if it was found after the wedding..." She paused, and her voice cracked for the first time. "After the wedding, I told myself it wouldn't matter anymore. Be someone new. Mrs. Whitfield. Untouchable. The letter would just be an old ghost with no power left." Daniel stared at her like he was looking at a stranger wearing his fiancée's face. "You were gambling on a technicality. And timing. On whether a hidden letter got found in 6 weeks or 6 years. Yes," Vivian said quietly. "And I lost." Marisol stood frozen against the bookshelf, feeling like she'd stumbled into the middle of a confession that was never meant for her ears. A confession that had somehow required her hands, her curiosity, her small act of disobedience with a stack of dusty hard covers, to finally see daylight. Daniel turned to her. "Marisol." His voice shook. "Thank you." She didn't know what to say. Thank you felt like the wrong words for what had just happened in this room, for the unraveling of a man's entire future, for the confession of something that could send a woman to prison, for the 6 years of silent service that had somehow, accidentally, become the reason a dead man's last words finally reached daylight. "I need you to call the police," Daniel said. His voice steadying with something that sounded almost like resolve forming out of wreckage. "Right now." Before she. But when they both turned, the office door was open, and Vivian was gone. Everything took a shocking turn. The house alarm was still armed, which meant Vivian hadn't gone out the front. Daniel took the stairs 2 at a time toward the garage, shouting her name, while Marisol stood frozen in the office holding a photograph of a dead man in his wedding suit, unsure whether to follow, to call the police herself, or to simply sit down on the floor and let her knees finally stop shaking. She chose the phone. Her hands were unsteady as she dialed 911, and the dispatcher's calm voice felt like the only solid thing in a house that had just come apart at the seams. She gave the address. She gave what little she understood of what had happened. A confession, a possible confession, a woman fleeing, and she stayed on the line as footsteps thundered back down the stairs. Daniel burst back into the office, breathless. "Her car's gone." She took the Mercedes. "I called the police," Marisol said. "They're coming." He nodded, but his eyes had the glassy, unfocused look of a man whose entire understanding of his own life had just been rewritten in under 10 minutes. He sat down heavily in the leather chair behind his desk, the chair Marisol had dusted every single week for 6 years without ever once imagining what conversation it might someday witness, and put his head in his hands. "I proposed to her in Aspen," he said, mostly to himself. "I picked out a 5-carat ring because I wanted to give her something that matched how I felt. I told my mother she was the one. I told my board she was the one, Marisol. I built a prenup around trust instead of protection because I actually believed." He stopped, followed. "I believed she loved me." Marisol didn't know what comfort a maid was allowed to offer a billionaire in the wreckage of his own engagement, so she offered the only thing she had. She stayed. She didn't leave the room, didn't retreat to her cart of cleaning supplies and pretend this hadn't happened. She simply stood there, steady, present, the way she'd learned to be steady and present through years of her own quiet hardships. A husband who left when Eli was 2, a mother who got sick and needed care she couldn't afford, A decade of learning that sometimes the only thing you can give someone in crisis is the fact that you didn't walk away. You couldn't have known, she said finally. People like her, they don't get caught by carelessness. They get caught by conscience. Somebody's conscience. Maybe hers, for keeping the letter instead of burning it. Maybe her husband's, for writing it in the first place. Daniel looked up at her and for the first time really looked, not through her, the way people who own 11 acres in a logistics empire often look through the people who clean their floors, but at her like he was seeing a whole person for the first time in 6 years. You could have put it back, he said. You could have pretended you never saw it. Nobody would have known. I would have known, Marisol said simply. The police arrived 11 minutes later. 2 patrol cars, then an unmarked sedan. Then a detective named Ruiz who spoke to Daniel and Marisol separately in the marble foyer while officers photographed the letter, the envelope, the reading room where it had all unraveled. Marisol gave her statement carefully, precisely, the way she'd learned to speak to authority figures who could, with one wrong word, decide her fate. Quiet, factual, no embellishment. Vivian's Mercedes was found 4 hours later at a private airfield 30 miles outside Charleston, abandoned near a hangar that belonged to a charter company she'd apparently used before, under a name that wasn't quite her own. She wasn't on any manifest. She wasn't anywhere. She had vanished. Cleanly, completely. The way a woman vanishes when she's spent years quietly preparing an exit she hoped she'd never need. Daniel stood in his own driveway that evening, watching Detective Ruiz's taillights disappear down the long gravel drive, and Marisol stood a respectful distance behind him with Eli's photo peeking out of her jacket pocket where she always kept it, and neither of them said anything for a long time. I don't know how to thank you, Daniel finally said without turning around. You just saved me from marrying a woman who might have. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. You don't have to thank me, Marisol said. I was just doing my job. Dusting shelves. It just happened to be the wrong shelf at the right time. Daniel turned to face her, and something in his exhausted expression had shifted into something steadier. No, he said. I don't think it was the wrong shelf at all. This is one story you'll never forget. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, aftershocks arriving in waves that neither Daniel nor Marisol could have predicted. The story broke in the local papers first. Charleston businessman's engagement collapses amid shocking allegations, and within days it had climbed to national outlets, then to true crime podcasts, then to strangers on the internet dissecting Vivian Ashcroft's entire life story looking for cracks they'd somehow missed. Old friends came forward. A cousin admitted Thomas's family had always quietly suspected something wasn't right about his death but had no proof, no resources, no way to fight a grieving young widow with a good lawyer and better tears. Detective Ruiz reopened the case on Thomas's death formally, using the letter as the foundation of a new investigation. An investigation that, months later, would lead to an arrest warrant, though Vivian herself remained missing, a ghost who had apparently planned her disappearance with the same cold precision she'd planned everything else in her adult life. Daniel cancelled the wedding, obviously. He cancelled the caterers, the florists, the 400 invitations already halfway printed. He gave interviews only when his lawyers insisted, kept his head down otherwise, and threw himself into work the way men like him always did when their personal lives became unbearable. Long hours, late nights, the particular numbness of staying too busy to feel anything. But something had shifted in him, quiet and unmistakable, and it centered, inconveniently, inexplicably, undeniably, around a woman who cleaned his house. Started small. He began saying good morning to Marisol instead of walking past her cart in the hallway. He asked once how her son was doing, and was startled by how much he actually wanted to know the answer. He noticed things he'd never noticed in 6 years, that she hummed old boleros under her breath while she worked, that she always left fresh flowers from the garden in a jar on the kitchen windowsill even though nobody had ever asked her to, that she'd once told him, offhand in passing weeks before any of this happened, that her dream had always been to open a small bakery, a real one with her late grandmother's recipes, if she ever saved enough. He hadn't saved that memory on purpose. It had just stayed with him the way small honest things sometimes do. One evening in late September, 6 weeks after the wedding that never happened, Daniel found Marisol in the kitchen finishing the last of her rounds, Eli's photo tucked as always in her apron pocket. And he did something he hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't even fully admitted to himself he wanted to do until the words were already leaving his mouth. "I'd like to help you open that bakery," he said. "Not as charity, as an investment. Because I've watched you work in this house for 6 years, and I've never once seen you do anything halfway. And I think whatever you build will be worth every penny." Marisol stared at him, cloth still in hand, genuinely speechless for the first time since she'd found that envelope behind the books. "Mr. Whitfield, I can't accept that. Too much. You barely." "I know you," Daniel interrupted gently. "Maybe better than I ever knew Vivian, and I was engaged to her for 2 years. That says something. Maybe it says something about her. But I think it also says something about you." She didn't answer right away. Behind her carefulness, behind 6 years of professional distance and quiet self-protection, something in her chest loosened. The particular ache of being seen, finally, after years of being useful but invisible. "I'll think about it," she said, which was as close to yes as her pride would let her get that evening. But it ended in a way no one imagined. 3 weeks later, Marisol sat across from Daniel at a small mahogany desk, not in the mansion's cold, imposing study, but in a modest office he'd rented downtown specifically for this, because he said the bakery deserved to start somewhere that wasn't haunted. Between them sat a business plan Marisol had stayed up 3 nights writing by hand, in a spiral notebook, translating her grandmother's recipes into cost projections she barely understood but had taught herself from library books and late-night internet searches after Eli went to bed. "You did all this yourself?" Daniel asked, flipping through pages covered in her careful, looping handwriting. "Every bit of it," she said. "I wanted it to be real before I asked anyone for help." He smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile Marisol had seen on him since the day the letter fell out of that bookshelf. "It's already real. It just needs an address." They found the space 2 weeks after that. A small corner storefront on a quiet Charleston street with good morning light and 100 years of history in its exposed brick walls. Marisol cried in the empty space on the day she got the keys, standing in the dust and echo of it, thinking about her grandmother's kitchen in a small house outside Havana, thinking about the years of scraping by, thinking about how close she'd come to putting that envelope back on the shelf and pretending she'd never seen it. If she had, if fear had won that day instead of curiosity, instead of conscience, none of this would exist. Daniel would likely be married by now to a woman capable of murder. Marisol would still be dusting shelves in a house built on secrets, and her dream would still be a spiral notebook full of recipes nobody but her family had ever tasted. Instead, on a bright October morning, Abuela's table opened its doors for the first time, named for the grandmother whose recipes had traveled 2 countries and 3 decades to finally have a home of their own. The bakery became, almost immediately, exactly the kind of place Charleston seemed to have been quietly waiting for. Warm, unpretentious, full of the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread, staffed partly by other single mothers Marisol had met over the years and made a quiet promise to hire the moment she ever had the means. Eli did his homework at the corner table every afternoon after school, surrounded by regulars who'd started calling him the mayor, because he greeted every customer by name within a week of meeting them. Daniel came by most mornings for coffee, not because he needed to check on his investment, but because, as he told Marisol once, half joking, half not, it had become the only place in Charleston that still felt honest to him. Vivian was never found. The investigation into Thomas's death remained open, cold in the way cases go cold when the person at the center of them simply disappears into the wide, unaccounted world. Occasionally a tip would surface, a sighting in Portugal, a rumor from Uruguay, and Daniel would go quiet for a day or two, processing whatever fresh reminder had reached him of how close he'd come to spending his life with someone capable of that kind of calculated cruelty. But mostly he moved forward. Slowly, deliberately, the way people rebuild after something breaks them open, not by forgetting but by choosing every single day to build something true instead. What happened after that was beyond imagination. By the following spring, Abuela's table had outgrown its corner storefront. Lines formed before opening on weekends. A local news segment featured Marisol's story, carefully, respectfully, focusing on resilience rather than scandal, and orders started coming in from 3 counties over for her grandmother's guava pastelitos. Daniel expanded his involvement, though never in a way that made Marisol feel like her creation belonged to anyone but herself. He helped her navigate contracts, introduced her to a distributor who could source better flour at a fairer price, sat quietly in the back booth some evenings doing his own work while she closed up, neither of them acknowledging out loud what had slowly, unmistakably grown between them, not out of scandal or convenience, but out of 6 years of quiet observation followed by months of genuine partnership. It was Eli, in the end, who said it first, the way children often say the truths adults are too careful to speak aloud. "Are you and Mr. Daniel getting married?" he asked one evening, swinging his legs on a bakery stool, entirely unbothered by the weight of the question. Marisol nearly dropped a tray of croissants. Daniel, sitting 2 tables away, went very still, then very red, then, to Marisol's surprise, very honest. "Would that be all right with you?" he asked Eli directly, treating the question with the seriousness of a business proposal, which made Marisol laugh despite herself, despite the sudden thundering of her own heart. Eli considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old CEO. "You'd have to come to my baseball games," he said. "Not just sometimes. Every time." "Every time," Daniel agreed without hesitation, and something about the simplicity of that promise. No grand gesture, no rehearsed speech, just a quiet vow to show up, undid Marisol more completely than any of the wealth or opportunity ever had. They didn't rush it. There was no ring in Aspen, no 5-carat diamond, no 400-person guest list. Daniel had learned, painfully, what those things could hide. Instead, on a warm evening a year and a half after the letter fell out of that bookshelf, he proposed in the bakery itself, after closing, with flour still dusted on Marisol's apron and Eli hiding, unsuccessfully, behind the counter to watch. "I don't want to give you a story with secrets in it," Daniel said, kneeling in the golden evening light of the shop she'd built with her own hands. "I want to give you a story that's true, all the way through, for the rest of our lives." Marisol said yes before he even finished the sentence. The biggest surprise was still waiting. Their wedding, when it finally happened, was nothing like the one that had been planned and cancelled 2 years before. No 400 guests. No towering white cake or ballroom orchestra. Just 40 people who actually mattered. Marisol's mother, frail but present, weeping through the entire ceremony. Eli as the world's most serious ring bearer. The small crew of women from the bakery who had become as close as family. And Daniel's own mother, who had once worried her son was marrying beneath his station and now, watching Marisol laugh through her vows with flour-dusted hands still faintly stained from that morning's baking, understood exactly what her son had actually found. They held the reception in the bakery itself, closed for the day, tables pushed together down the center of the room Marisol had built out of nothing but persistence and a grandmother's recipes. There was a small, quiet moment near the end of the evening that nobody else in the room fully understood the weight of. Daniel pulled Marisol aside, near the oven still warm from the day's baking, and pressed something small and folded into her palm. It was a photograph, new, not the old one from the bookshelf, but one he'd had specially framed. A picture of the 2 of them from a quiet Tuesday months earlier, taken by Eli on Daniel's phone without either of them noticing, laughing over a batch of burnt cookies that hadn't survived their first, and only, attempt at baking together. "I wanted our first framed photo together to be something real," Daniel said. "Not staged. Not hiding anything. Just us actually happy on an ordinary day." Marisol held the photograph against her chest and thought, not for the first time, about how close her life had come to looking entirely different. How one moment of curiosity behind a bookshelf, one small refusal to look away from something that frightened her, had unraveled a lie large enough to protect a murderer and in its unraveling, had somehow built an entirely new life for a maid and her son. She thought, too, about conscience, Thomas's, for writing that letter in the first place, knowing, perhaps, that he might not survive long enough to send it himself. And her own, for choosing honesty in a moment when silence would have been so much easier, so much safer. Some doors, she thought, are only opened by people brave enough to risk everything by opening them. This moment changed countless lives. 2 years into their marriage, Abuela's Table had become a small local institution, with a second location opening in nearby Savannah, run by one of the women Marisol had first hired as a single mother needing a second chance. Marisol had built something that had outgrown even her own dreams. Not just a bakery, but a kind of quiet refuge for women who understood, the way she once had, what it felt like to be underestimated, overlooked, and determined anyway. Daniel had changed too, in ways that went beyond the marriage itself. He'd restructured hiring practices across his own company after watching how much untapped brilliance existed in people the corporate world routinely dismissed. People like Marisol, whose talent had simply never been given a door to walk through. He established a small fund quietly, without press releases or self-congratulation, to help employees and their families pursue education or small business dreams of their own, the way he'd once helped Marisol pursue hers, not as charity but as investment in people he genuinely believed in. Vivian's case, meanwhile, remained a distant, occasional headline. A documentary crew reached out once, wanting to feature the story. Daniel declined, gently but firmly, unwilling to let his family's healing become entertainment for strangers. He wanted his story told honestly if it had to be told at all, not sensationalized, and he trusted that someday, if it mattered, the truth would find its own way into daylight, the way it always seemed to eventually for those patient enough and brave enough to look for it. Marisol thought about that old envelope sometimes, late at night, long after Eli had gone to sleep and the bakery ovens had gone cold for the day. She thought about how a single hidden letter, written by a dying man's trembling conscience, had traveled years in silence and fear to finally reach the hands of someone brave enough to read it. Not because she'd been looking for it, but because she'd simply refused to look away once she found it. She thought about how many secrets, in how many houses, stay buried simply because nobody dares to ask the uncomfortable question. And she thought, with quiet gratitude, about how close she'd come to putting that envelope back exactly where she found it, and how different, how much smaller, how much less true her entire life would have become if fear had won instead of conscience. This is only the beginning. The real story starts now. On a warm evening in early June, 3 years after everything began, Daniel and Marisol stood together in the doorway of Abuela's Table, watching Eli chase a soccer ball across the small courtyard out back that Daniel had built for him, laughing in the golden light of a Charleston sunset. "Do you ever think about that day?" Daniel asked, the way he sometimes did, quietly, without warning. "The bookshelf. The letter. Every time I dust a shelf," Marisol said, smiling. "Old habits." He laughed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their son grow up in a life neither of them could have imagined 3 years before. A life built not on secrets and calculated smiles, but on flower and sunlight and the simple radical decision to tell the truth even when silence would have been so much easier. There is a lesson in Marisol's story, one worth carrying with you long after you close this video. The truth doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it falls quietly from between two old books, waiting for someone brave enough to pick it up. Sometimes the smallest act of honesty, refusing to look away, refusing to stay silent, choosing conscience over comfort, becomes the single moment that changes everything that comes after. Marisol didn't set out to save anyone that day. She was just doing her job, dusting a shelf that had been dusted 1,000 times before. But her honesty, her courage in a moment that would have been so much easier to walk away from, became the foundation of an entirely new life. For herself, for her son, and for a man who finally learned what it meant to be loved without conditions, without performance, without secrets. If this story moved you, if it made you believe, even a little, that honesty still matters, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage, then do something small for us in return. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this one. Real, emotional, unforgettable. And if someone in your life could use a reminder that truth always finds its way to daylight, share this with them tonight. Thank you for staying until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.